Hi everyone, welcome back to Demand Decoded. Thanks for tuning in and taking the time to join us. I'm Dan Stilgo, Marketing Manager at Blend, and joined as usual by Phil Valander, who's co-founder at Blend. And today we're going to tackle a widespread challenge in marketing, which is balancing short-term results with long-term growth. And in particular, we're going to explore how the pressure for those quick wins, those short-term results, often leads to significant overspending on working budgets, while you seem to then neglect the crucial non-working investments that actually build sustainable long-term success. Let's get into the episode. So, Phil, this was actually a topic we've been riffing on a little bit since our podcast with Chris Walker a few months back, where he kind of introduced this concept in a new way, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, we've thought and known for a long time there's an issue with how businesses categorize their investments in the assets that create the long-term success, that are the foundations of long-term success, in particular their websites, how those investments are considered and thought about, labeled and measured. And our conversation with Chris put that in a really good frame of reference, which has helped to clarify our thinking a little bit, and it is worth exploring because there is a big issue there, and there's lots of reasons for it, but they're not reasons that should exist in reality, and they don't necessarily stand up to scrutiny. So it's really fascinating to think about it in terms of working versus non-working, and how that changes the way you think about where you invest and how much you invest. So yeah, it was really good to talk about it with Chris, and looking forward to digging in deeper today.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of it put that way before, which was the interesting thing to me, and yeah, why I kind of wanted to position that like in that way for this episode.
Yeah.
So I guess first let's outline actually what we mean then by working budget versus non-working budget.
I think there's a few ways that you can interpret that, and they may not be the absolute ideal words to use, but they're good enough. And it's basically saying that, an investment that you put out into the market to gain an immediate and incremental, in most cases, and measurable return is thought of in a working context, as in, I spend this money, I get something back. Whereas the money that you put into a usually larger one-off expense, you could liken it to CapEx versus OpEx. Now, a larger one-off expense, the return on which either you expect to come over a long period of time, and that actually may mean that you don't ever measure it, is what I think we can call a non-working investment. So in many ways, CapEx versus OpEx, the large spend that you invest in one go versus the smaller spends that add up to more, but are distributed more incrementally and scrutinized and measured in a different way, I think is the fundamental distinction.
I think that's a good way of coming at it from a business angle and comparing it to that as well. From a more tactical point of view, I think I look at it from the lens of short-term versus long-term impact in a lot of cases, because the working spend, as you kind of say, is often used for those immediate, measurable, incremental improvements that are a direct result of that investment, attributable, measurable, instant in a lot of cases, whereas the non-working budget is often used for things that will have a much longer term impact, and sometimes not a direct view of like attribution or measurable success.
Yeah, it's when you think about things in an attribution context, as in maybe not attributing revenue to a specific channel or specific creative, but what is contributing to our pipeline creation. It's often the working budget that's analyzed, thought about, and scrutinized, whereas the non-working budget is kind of like almost left to one side. There's another huge driver, I think, of the classification of these investments, and it's perceived risk. Ultimately, with a larger investment that goes at one time or on one thing, risk is always perceived to be higher. Now, compound risk across many small investments can, of course, easily exceed or even dwarf the risk associated with a large investment. But nevertheless, a lot of decision making is driven by risk reduction or risk avoidance. And so I think that forces thinking a little bit in terms of how different investments are categorized, classified, and evaluated. And we may come on to that in more detail, but I think all of these things shape the way that marketers and businesses think about their spend and lead us down paths that, are not always the best path to go down.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a really good point. Can we pick up on some examples that might distinguish the two, working budgets versus non-working?
So, as you've said, working budgets, tend to be the things that people expect an instant return on investment from. So advertising spend would be a perfect example, and probably the largest example in most businesses' marketing budgets. To some degree, events that businesses attend or run would be considered working because you're going to spend that money, measure that return on investment. And campaigns generally, where you're putting together a set of messages and assets in order to create some measurable response from your target market, would most likely consist of predominantly working type investments.
That's kind of like email. You might work with a third-party vendor to distribute a sponsored email or something to their list. It's all, I think advertising as a whole is a lot of where this budget goes.
Going to be the big one, yeah, absolutely. And then what would fall outside of that? What would fall into the non-working
websites? Are the biggest one, and we'll save the deeper conversation for websites, I think, in a few moments. But websites are often considered a non-working budget, I think, because they aren't seen to be actively out in the market working for you, which is bizarre, really, because they are an absolute workhorse for your business and everything you do in marketing. But we can touch on that a bit deeper.
It's the distance between the time of spend and the time of result. It creates this like almost an inability to look at that website as something that, even though we created it at a point in the past, it's doing its work every single day thereafter. Other non-working investments, typical one would be technology. Again, very much, although the majority of technology spend has moved from CapEx to OpEx models, they're still considered in a non-working context, right? You don't buy a new piece of MarTech software or solution to create a daily incremental measurable gain necessarily. You invest in it to power your process, and so it falls under that non-working mindset.
That's how it should be thought of. There might be cases where businesses are thinking of technology as working budget. If you think about like data intelligence tools and stuff like that, where you are getting almost an instant return on that, seeing what accounts are coming to your website, getting insight on contact information for those accounts and things like that. Maybe.
So should monthly software costs be part of your CAC calculation in a business?
Yeah, they could be.
Yeah, could be, couldn't they? Yeah. That's interesting. Anything else that's non-working?
Well, you've got the implementation cost of that technology.
Absolutely. Yeah, that would be an upfront capital
and
expenditure.
Just as important as the technology itself.
In some ways, more important. See many implementations not necessarily fail, but not achieve their potential because stopping to learn what a software product does when it's being used in its intended manner and to implement and adopt it properly is sometimes a hard thing to get a team of people. Let's not blame businesses or individuals, but to get a team of people in diverse roles to do that can be pretty challenging.
Yeah, for sure.
That's a sticky one. What about branding?
Yeah, I would say a rebrand probably does go into non-working. It's not something that's being spent or allocated budget for to actually, generate an instant return on that investment. Like branding as a whole could have some instant impacts, but it's hard to measure, and it's more of a long-term mindset, I think. And I think that's why I'd fall into non-working.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a necessary thing in order to achieve results, but it isn't on its own. It won't do it. You've got to activate it, and that's when campaigns and advertising
and that's the working cost,
and that's the working aspect of it. A branding exercise, is an investment in a foundation, I suppose, on which to build those other things. I'd put market research in as non-working as well. A one-off spend in capturing information that you can use to guide your actions, but it's not going to work for you on a daily budget. Something that I think is common to all of these that we've discussing so far is sort of time to results and direct or indirect impact on pipeline. All these branding, market research, acquisition of technology, these are not directly tied to results in the pipeline necessarily, whereas all the working budget is typically, at least conceptually, intended to create pipeline.
Yeah, but the non-working budget powers that working budget.
You can't do without it.
Market research is essential, really. Understanding your customer, your audience. Okay, so what are we going to distribute?
Yeah, absolutely.
Website, brand, all of these things are absolutely, and we can touch on that in a bit.
I think there are some candidates, maybe only one candidate that should be moved from one category to the other, perhaps. Any others that you wanted to?
Content. Yeah, we were chatting earlier. I saw a post and commented on a post on LinkedIn yesterday and just copied it here to reference. So somebody asked on LinkedIn, valid question to be fair, and it had a lot of comments and a lot of engagement on, because I think it got people thinking and talking. They said, are companies really paying $2,000 for a blog post, 2 to 3K words? I find it a bit hard to believe, so want to know the reality. Like, in fairness, this person was just genuinely curious, I think, about what's going on. Not at all. And I think my response to this was broadly that on paper, $2,000 for a blog post can seem like a lot, depending on the size of business, but a well-written, well-optimized blog post can drive thousands of visitors to your website, for years sometimes. And once it's written, it's going to be indexed by Google forever, really, unless something happens to your website or it gets de-indexed for some reason. It's unlikely. And you can re-optimize that and make it rank for literally years. Like that one piece of content, that $2,000 can have such a compounding impact on all of your marketing and your website traffic and things like that. So yes, companies are really paying $2,000 for a blog post like that because they understand the long-term impact of it. And what blows my mind is that businesses will happily blow $2,000 on, paid ads, like whether that be social or, some form of paid search or event ad, like any kind of advertising. $2,000 is seen as very little. You are not going to be able to reach a lot of people on any ad platform, especially search, for $2,000. And once that budget is used, it's gone.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's in many ways, let me be fair. In some ways, it's a better investment of $2,000 than many forms of ineffective advertising. So, for example, spending $2,000 on lead gen ads, for example, in the majority of business scenarios, if you look at the pipeline contribution and close rate of organic search visits compared to lead gen ad generated leads, night and day difference. And as you say, that piece of content can deliver you results that compound and grow over potentially many years. So it's because, again, it's the size of the investment is the same, but it's all being let go at once for one thing, as opposed to being let go incrementally for many little things. Lower perceived risk. But potentially the wrong way to think about it. And you can certainly write a very poor piece of content that will do nothing for you for much less. That's easy. Now you can just go to any AI chatbot and get it to produce a mediocre bog standard blog post with a completely neutral and balanced viewpoint that will do nothing for you. But to capture your opinion, to inject your insight, to craft and optimize a piece of content that will rank and contribute to your wider SEO, yes, that takes more, but it's money well spent in many cases.
Yeah. And this post prompted me to think, like, wow, are businesses now actually looking at some forms of content as non-working budget for them?
It's an interesting question. Ultimately, the cost of a blog post has always been a sort of emotive topic in marketing. We have a long history of charging what I think is reasonable and fair for blog post creation, but it's higher than a lot of other solutions that are available to our clients. There's no denying it, but we understand the long-term impact and value of that investment. And so I think, any time where there's a wide range of providers available, there's a perceived low barrier to entry. We can all write, don't need a professional if we can all write. It leads people to think incorrectly in some cases about what is the value of something and therefore what should it cost.
Yeah. It's scary to think that businesses will be looking at content through that lens, though. And again, I just think it is that instantaneous measurement of success that's missing.
Well, day one, you're not going to get the results from a blog post that necessarily pay back the 2K investment, but look at it after 2-3 years and in the intangible way, as in overall our organic traffic has grown by X%.
That's the thing, though. You can't directly measure the impact of a single blog post. Like, that would just be fundamentally wrong to do, because that's not its goal. It's the effect of ranking, across your entire website and the overall traffic you're generating, that maybe you can then retarget. And there's so many other things to look at, but you can't look at it from a direct attribution from that single blog post.
And that's increasingly true of many of the most effective marketing approaches today. We're going back to a time where the impact of marketing is less measurable. And so I think it's therefore important that marketing managers and directors and CMOs even have really good knowledge of what's going on in the buyer behavior landscape, and really strong conviction about how they look at results, because you have got to look beyond the page views and the instant return and the clicks and so on. You've got to look at how it's influencing buyers and use judgment in how you analyze those results and whether you consider them a success or not. It's not easy for people who are very used to performance-based measurement of reach, clicks, leads, and those sorts of things.
I mean, maybe that's a topic for another day, like the death of performance marketing.
It's really changing the way marketers need to think about where they spend their money and how they measure or assess the impact.
Yeah, for sure. So in terms of content, I think sadly it is seen in some businesses as non-working, but it should be in the working budget category. So I feel like we've touched on this a little bit. But what are some of the dangers of overinvesting in those working channels while neglecting those non-working, what we might consider foundational investments?
Well, I suppose the biggest danger is terrible ROI in the form of pipeline creation. One of the most powerful things that you can learn by doing the split funnel analysis, of which we're big fans, is seeing just how much of your pipeline is coming from the working versus the non-working investments in a measurable way. And it's usually non-working investments, websites, content, if we're labeling content as a non-working perceived investment, brand, even to a degree, that are producing the buyers that are in your pipeline and closing. Whereas, huge amounts of spend on working channels at the expense of those non-working channels can create a high level of measurable, trackable events and potentially leads. But when you look further down the pipeline, further down the sales process, those results taper off pretty rapidly. I think is one of the dangers.
Yeah.
You've probably got a few others to share.
Yeah, just some other thoughts on it as well, really. Like, I think it all comes back to that short-term mindset that some businesses have and the need to prioritize those short-term results. That then leads to that overinvestment in working channels like advertising, mainly, let's face it, and other forms of like immediate content distribution to see results off the back of it, and overinvestment in events, that kind of thing, because you get that tangible immediate impact. But obviously, you know, we know the issue with that is lots of those things and leads and things generated from those activities simply don't convert into pipeline and revenue. So again, like, yeah, I think really just to echo that point, the ROI from those things will be so incredibly poor that you should look to invest elsewhere.
Yeah, there's another sort of consequence, which is to some degree, overspending leads to more overspending, which is when you spend on what we traditionally think of as working channels, tactics, budgets, places, at the expense of those non-working ones, and you measure and you attribute the hell out of those results, you're going to see those results decline.
Mm-hmm.
You know, not only are they poor now, but they will decline. The cost of a click and a lead on all the platforms that we use is increasing all the time. So, you know, poor results, when you're looking at a lens that only allows you to really measure and assess the things that you're using, often leads to, well, we've got to spend more to get the same result, let alone to grow the result. So we're going to have to spend more on advertising. We're going to have to spend more on events. We're going to have to spend more on campaigns, you know, just to hold steady.
Yeah.
Let alone to increase what we deliver to the sales team in the form of, you know, crappy leads or MQLs by 10%. That's going to take another, you know, 20%, you know, increase on the budget on these working channels. So overspending might lead you to overspend even more in the future, largely to your point, because of the way you're looking at what you're generating and what your results are and what your return on investment is. And you're not factoring in the role of those other things in creating your results.
Yeah. You make a really good point there, actually, I think, which is about the impact that this will have, you know, in the future and more years down the line, essentially. Like, when you're over investing in these short-term immediate impact results and not focused on long-term growth strategies, again, mainly focusing on kind of ads, events, that kind of thing here, actually more and more buyers are avoiding those things. They are going dark in terms of the way that they research their buying process. They're harder to reach and influence before they're actually ready to make the purchase in the first place. So yeah, for sure, it will cost more to get those people that are kind of actively available in the market and those that we can see and reach. And ultimately, these short-term working budget things will have a decreased effectiveness because more and more buyers like don't want to be influenced by these things. They want to do research and the buying process independently, away from all of that.
Yeah. And as more businesses adopt the same platforms, channels, and tactics, you know, competition will increase, which will increase the cost. All platforms that are available to us when it comes to, you know, advertising are, you know, monetizing themselves as effectively as possible. That's increasing cost per click all the time. And as you say, it's results from this approach are going to decline. Cost of each result is going to increase. Therefore, there are two reasons why budgets will need to increase if you hope to retain or grow the same level of results, whilst looking at the in context results, which usually are not the best results to look at in terms of measuring ROI.
Yeah. This ads thing is such a huge issue. Just did a quick calculation just for my own benefit and, whilst we're on air. So that £2,000 example that we just said about.
Yeah.
So when we were running paid ads like last year and stuff, our average cost per click for a high intent like HubSpot website related keyword was around £20 to £30.
Okay.
Which is outrageous, right? When you think about it, the cost of that is eye-wateringly like huge for one click.
Yeah.
But that was the reality of it, know.
Wow.
And out of that £2,000 budget, we'd likely get 80 clicks to the website.
Okay.
But organically, the same page that we were driving those ads to, our website service page, we get hundreds of visits to a month from organic traffic. And if you invested that, it may be seen as non-working at the time because it's not actively out in the market producing instant leads for you. But over time, we've invested in content around that page that enhances its performance in search. And, it's had that compounding effect that then leads to better results than your working budget could get you.
Yeah. And that's just views, where that paid spend, you could argue, looks fairly healthy, positive, relative to its pipeline generation performance. Yeah, fascinating. It is always so interesting to see how willingly businesses can spend on paid in particular, very little measurable return, versus the reluctance to spend on certain other things because of how they're labeled, contextualized, and considered.
Yeah.
And it hopefully will change.
Yeah. Brand, right? We've touched on brand very briefly, I'd say, and brand building. What role do you think brand building plays in the working versus non-working budget debate? And like, do you think businesses view budget assigned to like brand building things and activity as working or non-working?
I'm sure in most cases they would consider it as a working investment in activating their brand. In terms of the big challenge with anything to do with brand is measurability. And I'd also argue that, kind of anything that you do that isn't completely focused and optimized for lead generation can have a brand building effect. And the reason this is interesting at the moment is because we're seeing the importance and the power of having a memorable, differentiated, trusted and liked brand in B2B spaces, given the saturation of channels, given the rise of volumes of content and ads and costs and so on. Brand is being seen again as a valuable asset. But I think if anybody is consciously, intentionally doing brand building work, they would be looking at it as a working investment. That doesn't necessarily mean they're able to measure it in an effective way, because of course, how do you measure the degree to which you've built your brand in the minds of your buyers? You really can't. But I think that's where I stand.
Yeah,
maybe there's another way to
I think you're right, though. The businesses that are doing this will probably look at it from a working budget spend, but there will be a lot of businesses out there that refuse to invest in brand awareness, brand building activities that don't have an immediate return on investment and are hard to measure, for those reasons, basically. But yeah, I think the forward thinking businesses that understand the impact that brand can have on them will, quite openly go out and spend considerable working budget on brand building activity, even with the lack of measurability around it.
I think it's probably a bit of a luxury that only bigger businesses can afford and potentially justify. Everything you do can have a brand building effect. I like to think about that. Everything that we do that's aligned to what buyers need and want from us has a brand building effect, whether they convert today, tomorrow, or in a year. If they've seen us, if they've appreciated us, if they've taken some value away, The brand is built in their minds. Having a specific budget to put aside into, putting our logo on a billboard in Times Square to build brand is something that SMEs that need pipeline today probably can't afford to prioritize. But when you're in a position where you can, you're going to be looking at as, we're doing this in order to measurably or immeasurably drive brand awareness. Probably, on a daily basis.
Yeah. And I suppose the businesses that aren't doing it, like brand activity, just don't see it as a priority.
Yeah.
Websites.
The big one.
Websites.
Yeah.
Should websites then be considered as a working investment? Working budget?
Well, it's a good question. And I'm only hesitating because working budget, it just so logically applies to incremental spend, and websites are not going to be incremental spend. But incremental return, they absolutely do deliver. And so they should be thought of much differently to the way they are today. So, and yes, if we get down to nuts and bolts, they should be considered part of your working assets.
Yeah.
You may spend 20, 30, 50, 100K upfront to build the website that you need to communicate your brand and proposition and to drive results. But the return on that investment is present in every visit, lead, high intent lead, opportunity that's created, and customer that's won. So it's a non-working return on it's a working return on investment, even though it's a large upfront expenditure in most cases. So I would like to see it thought of in the context of working rather than non-working budgets. I think
it needs to be thought of in that way.
Yeah.
I think, like you say, it's just the upfront cost of it, I think, is why it gets placed into the non-working budget.
So much of this is driven by how we measure things as well. And it's important when you measure things the right way, you make the right decisions fundamentally. The fact that businesses will frequently, set aside, let's just pick a number out of the air, 100K to invest in paid advertising in a 12-month period. Not unusual. We hear about it all the time. But then when it comes to tendering, which they often do for their new website, they will, not unusual to approach agencies and businesses with a budget of 10, 15, 20K. Even pretty mature, pretty large companies try to minimize the cost to them of their website. And it's because they're not measuring that website in the same way they're measuring that other spend. They're not measuring that website in terms of daily, monthly, quarterly return on investment, contribution to pipeline, and attribution software, when it's being used, typically won't help them do so.
No.
It's a forgotten expenditure that's relatively large and therefore relatively high risk. And so we try to shrink it. People try to spend the minimum because then we're risking the minimum.
Yeah, but you know what? Like you just said, the investment is relatively large. Actually, I think for a lot of businesses, when you look at their overall marketing budget, the budget for a website is actually relatively small.
Yeah.
So I've seen it, where marketing team has a budget of say 2 mil. Website budget for this year, like complete overhaul, design, development, strategy, 50K.
Yeah.
Okay, so then with the rest of that budget, which is, again, nearly 2 mil pretty much, where are all of the buyers, the audience, everybody else that is being influenced by the rest of that budget? Where will they end up? On the website that you're spending pennies on.
Yeah, it's, some proportion of virtually all marketing spend, certainly all digital marketing spend, but even broader, some proportion of that spend is all intended to bring a visitor to your website.
Yeah.
So the quality, efficiency, and effectiveness of that website experience at turning them into something valuable to you is paramount. And yet it attracts such a different mindset in terms of how it's costed. I think there's like a unit thinking fallacy, which is, from this cost we get one website.
Yeah.
Whereas from this cost we get one click, one lead, one visit, and the cost of one couldn't be more different. But like you say, those ones add up very quickly in working channels to exceed, and in many cases dwarf, the cost of one website. But it isn't one website you get in return for your investment. It is a proportion of probably every single deal you do.
Yeah. But it's hard to outline what the return on investment will be from the outset of a website project. Whereas if you're spending, say 50K on Google Ads, you could probably do some calculation to say this is how many leads we might expect from those campaigns, or at least clicks. That's not the ideal thing, but you can quite easily say this is what we will get back from that budget.
Yeah.
With a website, that's often not the case.
Yeah, and that's what needs to change. The way we think about the role of the website in our growth, in our success, needs to change. Because if you measure a website in terms of how much it costs you, then you will always try to minimize that cost. Whereas if you measure the website in terms of how much does it contribute to the creation of pipeline that we can then close, it's a totally different way of looking at it. And it might not lead you to spend everything on the website and nothing else on anything else, of course, but it might help you to think differently about what's a sensible investment in improving pipeline generation. I've said before that I think that visitor to high intent inquiry conversion rate is one of the most important metrics in all digital marketing, let alone it within website planning and measurement. But an increase in that rate through building a website that does its job well, we could talk about what its job is, but increasing that rate has huge value. And if you look at the value created, you'll look at the investment differently. Another thing that needs to change about the way businesses think about their website is that even if there's still a perceptually significant upfront cost, businesses should also invest over time in a working way in continual improvement of that website. Content creation could be considered one of those investments, but also updates to that website, need to be invested in. There's no point spending a whole heap of money at the start and then not doing anything to incrementally improve, maintain, and increase the contribution of that website to your pipeline. So not only do people need to think differently about their upfront investment in their website, I think it's time to think differently about the ongoing spend. And part of your marketing budget, should be creation of website and evolution of that website alongside creation of content, campaigns, events, paid, and all those other things we've talked about.
Yeah. And again, though, I think that comes back to measurement, because people aren't looking at the things that are influenced by the website. Like, okay, how do we improve our website visitor to high intent lead rate?
Yeah.
A lot of that comes down to the website design, UX, function, copy, messaging, things like that. But because people aren't looking at that unit of measurement, I think it gets missed.
Yeah, absolutely. We get, well, not us, because we look at every website as a revenue creating asset, but I think the website industry is pretty caught up in itself in terms of this is a this is a brand exercise to some, this is a content creation exercise to others. It's how it looks is the most important thing to many stakeholders, and in some ways it's far from being the most important thing.
Yeah.
Especially when you're looking at it through the lens of yourself as opposed to your buyer. How it looks to your buyer is arguably a very important thing, but even more important than that is how efficient and effective is it at giving buyers what they need and want when they arrive and taking them on a journey into your pipeline. Those are the things that should be top of the list when it comes to evaluating an approach to a website, the cost of a website, the investment in a website, and measuring its return on investment.
Yeah, totally. Cool. Anything else to say on websites?
Just that they're playing a role in every deal that you do. We've already said that. Whenever you spend money, effectively or otherwise, on paid advertising, on brand building, on events, on campaigns, you're usually going to be pointing people to that website. Website budgets are often set based on the cost of design and development. They frequently overlook strategy and copy creation, and those two things are equally important to design and development. An effective website in terms of pipeline creation has to perform well. Development needs to be quality. It has to provide a effective user experience, customer journey, and communicate your brand and your proposition. Design is a crucial aspect. It needs to communicate your offer, your differentiation, what you do, why you're the best solution for the right kind of buyer. Well, copy is key. And the structure, navigation, the journey through it, what it's optimized for in terms of keywords and SEO, what content you create now and in the future, strategy is the overarching key element in all of it. Those four things all need to be considered, balanced, and invested in equally. And that might mean that your budget needs to go up in order to do all four of those things to the required standard.
Or, you look at priorities and reconsider those to make the best use of that budget.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, which you just spoke about actually on our other podcast, Websites Decoded.
Yes.
Actually, that went out today. How to build a effective B2B website on a tight budget.
Right.
So, yeah, if you're interested, definitely go and listen to that, because I think you made some good points on there.
Yeah.
Let's move on to actually putting some of this into practice. So the website, for example, we're saying, if you've got a 2 mil marketing budget and your budget for the website is 50k, how do you actually then go to stakeholders in the business and say, you know what, this budget for the website should be 200-300k? Because I think everybody in the business will have a certain perception of how much a website will cost, because they'd have been through website projects in the past and will understand how much they cost in the past.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How do you bridge that gap?
It's an interesting question. And one that maybe hasn't been answered before, because the value of a website is a proportion of every deal that you do. Split funnel analysis, which we talk about often, will obviously show you the inefficiencies of certain types of lead generation, fundamentally, usually, of certain channels, of certain sources, of certain intents, and it will show you the efficiency of other intents, high intent in particular. It still won't necessarily bring your attention to the fact that high intent is, up to 50% of it is the product of the website. So I think if you've established an understanding for yourself and are ready to go to stakeholders with the fact that high intent inquiries that are anonymous up until the point they arrive on your website and convert on your website are already generating the majority of your pipeline. It's not that they will or they can, they're already doing it. You then probably need to look at a kind of attribution approach, not a software-based attribution approach, which will tell you to spend everything on LinkedIn or Twitter or Google or whatever the winning software channel is. But you've got to say, well, if we generated 50 million in pipeline from high intent leads, then potentially up to 50% of that pipeline needs to be attributed to the experience they had on our website. And you can start to build your business case for the website investment around the potential to generate that pipeline.
I
think.
Totally agree. I would hone in on that split funnel analysis, I think, because it will ultimately show you which leads are converting most effectively. Like you said, will be those high intent leads, which all come from your website. They all come from those high intent forms on your website, and it is a byproduct of how good your website is.
Yes.
If your website's better,
yes,
you should expect more.
There's a warning there. There's a gotcha, which is split funnel analysis will tell you, high intent leads that convert on our website are going to convert the best. you'll often look at where those high intent leads came from, self-reported attribution or software attribution being typically used ways. Now, of course, self-reported attribution will rarely say your website is why I converted. They will normally say, saw you on LinkedIn, read a blog post 2 years ago, downloaded an ebook when you had them. We've had that one in the past. You know, a variety of sources that lead to high intent conversions. But like you say, those high intent conversions won't happen if your website doesn't make them possible. So therefore, there's probably a bit of analysis needed on our part to figure out what would be what would drive your percentage attribution to the website. But ultimately, if you've got great sources of your ideal customer, LinkedIn, podcast, content, SEO, etc., and no website for them to go to, or a website that has a really, really bad visitor to high intent conversion ratio, then you're not going to get any of those high intent inquiries. So, there's a split there. I'm going to start with 50-50. So 50% of every deal that comes through this route is because of our website.
Yeah. I think when it comes to typical monthly, quarterly, annual reporting, the website conversion rate and metrics need to be brought up to that level and included in this reporting. Otherwise, they get forgotten.
Totally.
That point you just made around when you look at attribution, self-reported, software, whatever it may be, the website isn't mentioned.
Yeah.
And that's why so much of the budget goes to these working channels and not these non-working investments, because the non-working investments aren't measurable or mentioned in attribution.
It's key. That's key.
Yeah.
You like I say, you've got to bring these things up to the right level because they won't be there naturally. And that results in them being overlooked. And that results in you underspending, underinvesting, and overspending elsewhere.
Yeah. So just a bit of tactical advice on that, actually reporting consistently on that website visitor to high intent lead percentage, which is likely to be quite low in all fairness.
Low.
It's going to be a low percentage.
It is. Yeah, absolutely. So it's going to be low in our sort of like relative context relative to other
you're probably looking around like 1% to start with.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's probably good.
Yeah. But you're right, it is an important metric to understand, and low is okay because that's to be expected. If you're generating a high volume of visits through quality content creation, distribution, through building brand and affinity, if you were measuring other things, earlier up the buying process, you might have higher ratios, but the funnel is the funnel.
Yeah, it's so frustrating actually, because we report on so many other conversion rates. We report on pipeline to closed won. We report on high intent lead to opportunity, but we don't report, well, we do, but a lot of marketers don't report on that website visitor to high intent lead ratio.
Yeah.
And it's a missing piece of the puzzle.
It's vital, I think.
Yeah.
And they will most often be reporting on visit to contact or visit to lead.
Yeah.
Which includes those things. But anytime you include the good high intent inquiries with the bad ebook downloads, you often lose the ability to see either. And you treat them both as the same. You average out the results and the performance, and it's really, really misleading. So I think maybe that the campaign that we need to start is one whereby every website, every marketer measures their website in terms of visitor to high intent lead conversion rate, in addition to those other things if they need to, because it's the most important thing in terms of measuring impact, justifying investment, and decision making.
Yeah, that is the justification for investment.
Yeah.
Do you want to increase this conversion rate?
Yeah.
Okay, let's invest more on the website.
And if we do, what will be the the value of that result?
Yeah.
It's not hard to calculate.
Yeah, you can measure it directly there. Okay, I feel like we've gone to town on website there, which was good. I think that is needed because it's such an issue in the market right now. In terms of shifting other budget away though from short-term working budget investments like ads, events and things like that to those long terms, we touched on it a little bit, but I do think just taking a higher level approach. Like there is a mindset change here and an organizational shift, stakeholder education, like that needs to happen here, because ultimately if you're going to an event and scanning 2,000 badges, if you see in split funnel analysis or other forms of measurement and reporting that they are converting at a terrible rate into pipeline and customer, and we should just cut them out, obviously there's an issue there that you'll have 2,000 less leads to follow up on. And if you've got a large sales function, okay, then what do? Like, and there can be red flags seen there. Okay, so we're cutting all this spend from ads and events that are generating these immediate leads that, okay, we can measure, but they're not converting to anything. So if we just went ahead and cut the cost and cut that out altogether, you'll it's going to come to attention like, oh, right, we're down 500 leads this month. What the hell's going on?
Yeah. You're our resident expert on this, so I'll come back to you. But ultimately, that what we see universally is that there's often some form of resistance for making these changes, and the resistance can come from, organizational facts. We're two separate teams with two different KPIs, and we're unable to change how we're measured. Therefore, we're unable to change our approach. There can be, sort of conceptual resistance, like disagreement with the strategy, with the ideas, with the concepts that are being promoted, which, can be very hard to shift people on because it requires so much, learning in some cases, being challenging the way we think about things and the way we believe things are work. And, there's always a tendency amongst humans, to do things the way we've always done them, because that's less scary, that requires no change, and change is hard. So the resistance can come from many different directions. And that's why smaller businesses, more agile, often able to implement these approaches with relative ease. And I mean, they should, because it's a game changer and it can put growth on a fast track. So that's really exciting for them. It was certainly like that for us. But in a larger, more mature business where you've got potentially marketing and sales teams, and you've got banks of SDRs, and you've got AEs, and you've got a marketing team measured on something else, that's where, to your point, you've got to potentially build consensus, change minds, and data is one of the most valuable things that a marketer can gather to help them to do that. I think you'd probably agree with that. Are there any other things that they need to be doing with their colleagues, managers, directors, team members?
Yeah, it just comes back to an education piece and just getting everybody on board with the same things. It's easy for us to sit here and say, well, you're spending too much on working budget and you should be spending more on non-working budget, things like your website. But actually, in reality, it's not that easy, because that working budget is powering the things that you're measured on as a marketing team, like leads, like MQLs, like those things that then go on to power the sales team. And the sales team's been invested in heavily to occupy all of those marketing leads and things that you're generating. So if you were to just all of a sudden shift that budget, even if it's not working effectively to generate pipeline and revenue, and just shift it to non-working things that might actually help do those, there is then an organizational problem that those salespeople, for example, won't have, these leads and prospects to follow up on. And obviously a plan needs to be put in place there around what you do with this big sales org that you likely don't have enough high intent leads to fill their day with and fill their pipeline with, because it's being filled with currently poor quality, low intent leads that don't convert highly, but it's giving them activity to do and warrants them being in the team. I'd probably refer back to Alice DeCourcy at Cognism spoke quite well. I think in her Diary of a CMO speaks about this shift, right? And also spoke to Ben Smith, director of marketing at Reach Desk, think that was the last episode that went out actually, where he was saying their sales function just focus on actual high intent accounts. They use intent data and things like that. They are so hyper targeted on the accounts they have. They're working such a small number of accounts at a time that it does occupy lots of their sales team's time and activity, just because they are so hyper targeted and personalized in their outreach and things like that. It's not a volume game, it's just all about quality.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and every case is different, and you've got to look at the real facts and the real data. But I recall, that studies, data has shown that often there is a high level of difference or discrepancy between the people that are passed to sales in the form of leads and MQLs by marketing and the people that sales themselves target for prospecting. And, to some degree, have better results with people they prospect to than with marketing sourced leads, not high intent leads, of course. So I started to hypothesize that in some businesses, you might find that actually an SDR team initially can be quite comfortable with not being passed a high volume of really, really low quality, really, really low conversion rate marketing leads, because to them that might just be time that's wasted given its return on investment for them. So they can spend their time prospecting the way they have been anyway and gradually shifting into perhaps a more targeted version of that as the volume of high intent leads that you pass to those sales teams get utilized. So there's a really interesting thing to be explored there in terms of, well, how is their time being used currently and how is it effective? But that's drifting a little bit off topic, which is to say that, you've got to be able to talk to and partner with sales if you're a marketing team in order to make this shift and make this change, because you are going to be affecting what you're supplying them to, I suppose.
Yeah, and just had a quick thought on that, and I wrap things up in a minute, but a lot of things do come back to the objectives for sales, and I'm maybe not an expert on this, but like the comp plan that's then given to them, like if they are incentivized to just generate pipeline, they probably don't want your crappy leads.
Yeah,
because they're not incentivized to convert those. Well,
they are incentivized, but they're not motivated because it doesn't
work.
Yeah.
Whereas if you've got BDRs that are incentivized for calls booked and things like that, well, they are going to be really interested in how many leads you're sending over because they want to book as many calls as possible. And it's likely, if you just focus on high intent leads, well, those calls are going to be booked instantly anyway, and at a volume controlled by marketing.
I think if you're in a siloed marketing team, as in you're separate from sales, you're measured differently, different leadership, and you want to move investment from non-working to working, or move investments from non-working to working, spend your money differently, then you'd better get very, very close with sales leadership, because they are going to be really important in building your case together. And there's another element, which is a challenge that is not unusual, which is it's not unusual for marketers to be unable to measure the return on their marketing spend in the form of pipeline, either because of siloed teams, disconnected systems, lack of data. And again, that's a kind of challenge that has to be overcome first before a lot of this other stuff becomes possible. So in a siloed organization, building a bridge, forming an alliance with sales leadership, probably going to be quite important.
Yeah, I think just to wrap things up here, a lot of this comes back to measurement and attribution, which is why so much budget gets assigned to the working things that you're doing versus the non-working things, and finding ways to take it up a notch to a higher level and measure the impact on pipeline revenue, like commercial results outside of those instant that instant attribution that you get from a lot of platforms will help you make the case for shifting budget sensibly, like based on reporting and things that you've seen.
Yeah. There's probably one more thing that's just come to my mind, which is a way to look at and identify working versus non-working investments is, are they reaching the buyer? Are they touching the buyer on our behalf and having generating a result? So, your website is reaching your buyer daily, therefore treating it as a non-working investment is incorrect. It's working for you. Just like ads that you put out are working for you, events you show up at are working for you, campaigns, podcasts, content you create. These things are reaching, touching, influencing your buyer on a daily basis, as is your website. Whereas other things that you create to enable that won't be. Your customer won't be seeing your CRM. Your customer won't be seeing your marketing automation platform. They won't be seeing your, data tools and research and so on. So I think those are comfortable as non-working investments that make everything else possible.
Yeah, that's a good way to define it, I think. Yeah, something that everyone can probably
Reach the
use
buyer,
and think of.
touch the buyer.
Yeah. Cool. All right, let's wrap it up there. If there's nothing else. No, we're all good. Okay.
Done.
Yeah, let's wrap it up there. And actually, I am going to plug Websites Decoded at the end here, because we spoke about websites a lot, and I think you've been putting out some really good episodes on Websites Decoded, just advice to improve that conversion rate from visitor to high intent lead, how to go about website projects in terms of budgeting, investment, and just some really, really good tips on how to get more from that website, which we know is such a crucial part of B2B marketing.
Absolutely.
So little plug there.
Thank you.
Go check it out. Let's wrap it up there. Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed this episode of Demand Decoded. Be sure to follow the Blend LinkedIn page for other future events, or check out previous episodes on all the channels, basically, where you'd get your podcast. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time. Bye, everyone.
Bye for now.